Welcome back to another episode of Infidelity Tales Lab. We're thankful for your continued viewership. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We love knowing our global reach. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Perfect Dinner. Vince Rodriguez stood in his kitchen at 2 a.m., methodically cleaning the last of the cast iron pans. 3 days of preparation. 23 carefully planned portions of his wife Miranda's favorite dishes. The lamb had been marinating for 48 hours. The dessert, a custom chocolate souffle recipe he'd perfected over months, sat cooling in the refrigerator, waiting for a celebration that would never come. His phone buzzed on the granite counter. Miranda's text glowed in the darkness. "We've decided to celebrate at a restaurant. It's real family only. Real family." Vince set down the pan with deliberate precision. In his 20-year military career, he'd learned to control his breathing during moments of crisis. In Afghanistan, that control had saved lives. Tonight, it might save his marriage or end it forever. He scrolled up through their text thread. For weeks, Miranda had been enthusiastic about the home celebration. She'd specifically requested he take time off from his consulting firm to cook. She made lists. She'd insisted on the guest count of 23, including her sister's family, her college friends, even her difficult mother. But now, suddenly, it was real family only at some restaurant. And somehow, her husband of 15 years didn't qualify. Vince walked to his study, muscle memory guiding him through the dark house. The room held relics of his former life. Commendations from 3 tours overseas, photos with his unit, and in the locked bottom drawer of his desk, tools and contacts he'd hoped never to use again. Vincent Rodriguez wasn't just any consultant. He was a former Army intelligence officer who'd spent a decade in psychological operations. He pulled out a burner phone and activated the tracking app he'd installed on Miranda's iPhone 6 months ago. Not out of suspicion, but habit. Old training died hard. The phone showed her current location, Grandview Heights, the affluent neighborhood across town. At 2:15 a.m., she wasn't at her sister's house. She wasn't at her mother's. She was at 847 Maple Ridge Drive, a property that, according to his quick online search, belonged to one Bradley Thornton, a real estate developer who'd recently moved from Seattle. Vince had never heard Miranda mention Bradley Thornton. He spent the next hour conducting what he mentally cataloged as basic reconnaissance. Social media revealed Bradley was recently divorced, owned several properties across the state, and had apparently met Miranda at a charity gala 3 months ago, an event Vince hadn't attended due to a work commitment. The photos on Bradley's Instagram told the story. Expensive restaurants, wine tastings, gallery openings, and in several recent photos, partially cropped out but clearly visible, was Miranda's distinctive silver bracelet, the one Vince had bought her for their 10th anniversary. By 4 a.m., Vince had constructed a timeline. The charity gala in March. A sudden increase in Miranda's girls' nights out. Her new interest in yoga classes that seemed to run long. Her suggestion that Vince needed to work on himself and be more spontaneous. The final piece clicked into place when he found the receipt. Miranda had left her purse on the kitchen counter, and tucked inside was a dinner receipt for 2 from Romano's, dated last Tuesday, when she'd claimed to be working late. The receipt showed 2 entrees, a bottle of wine that cost more than most people's car payments, and a dessert they'd shared. Vince photographed everything with military precision, then returned each item to its exact position. In his years of intelligence work, he'd learned that premature exposure was the enemy of a successful operation. Miranda would never see him coming. As dawn broke over their suburban home, Vince made coffee and sat at the kitchen island, surrounded by enough food for 23 people. He'd spent 15 years building what he thought was an unshakable foundation with Miranda. They'd weathered his deployments, his transition to civilian life, his struggles with civilian authority. She'd been his anchor. But anchors, he now realized, could also be weights that dragged you down. His phone buzzed again. Miranda, sorry honey, got too tired and crashed at Jenny's. See you tonight. Thanks for understanding about the party change. Love you. Jenny lived in Riverside, 40 minutes in the opposite direction from Grandview Heights. Vince deleted the message without responding. In the military, they taught him that every mission required three things: intelligence, planning, and execution. He had the intelligence now. It was time to begin planning. He opened his laptop and began researching Bradley Thornton in earnest. By the time Miranda returned home that evening, Vince would know everything there was to know about the man who'd stolen his wife. And more importantly, he'd know exactly how to destroy him. Chapter 2. Intelligence Gathering. Miranda returned home at 6 p.m., her hair perfectly styled despite supposedly sleeping at Jenny's house. She kissed Vince's cheek with practiced affection and immediately began chattering about her day, a habit he'd once found endearing but now recognized as a deflection technique. "The restaurant was amazing," she said, pulling leftovers from her purse. Expensive-looking containers that definitely didn't come from any place that served real family dinners. "Mom actually behaved herself for once, and the kids loved the atmosphere." Vince nodded and made appropriate noises while mentally cataloging each lie. He'd already confirmed that Miranda's mother was in Florida visiting her own sister. The kids she referenced were a nephew and niece who'd posted Instagram stories from a baseball game across town during the supposed dinner time. "I'm sorry about all your cooking," Miranda continued, gesturing vaguely at the refrigerator full of untouched food. "Maybe we can have some friends over this weekend?" "Of course," Vince replied smoothly. "Whatever you think is best." That night, while Miranda slept, Vince began phase 2 of his intelligence operation. Using skills he'd honed tracking insurgents in foreign countries, he built a comprehensive profile of Bradley Thornton. The man was 42, divorced 8 months ago after his wife discovered he'd been systematically manipulating their joint finances to fund his gambling addiction. The divorce papers, which Vince accessed through methods that would have concerned a civilian attorney, revealed Bradley had been forced to liquidate most of his assets to pay debts. The real estate empire Bradley projected on social media was largely fictional. He owned 3 properties, all heavily mortgaged, and was facing foreclosure proceedings on 2 of them. His development company existed primarily on paper and borrowed credibility. More interesting was Bradley's pattern. Vince found similar stories in Seattle and Portland. Wealthy women, whirlwind affairs, sudden financial entanglements. Bradley had a type: successful, married women who felt underappreciated by their husbands. He studied them, learned their vulnerabilities, then exploited those weaknesses for financial gain. Miranda fit the profile perfectly. Her inheritance from her grandmother sat in an account she'd maintained separately from their joint finances. Nearly $400,000 that Vince had never touched, respecting her desire for independence. According to bank records he probably shouldn't have been able to access, Miranda had withdrawn $50,000 3 weeks ago. The pieces of Bradley's operation became clear over the next few days of surveillance. He ran what amounted to a long-term confidence game, presenting himself as a successful developer while actually targeting vulnerable women for their assets. The expensive dinners, the luxury appearances, all funded by his marks until he could gain access to larger sums. But Vince also discovered something else. Bradley wasn't working alone. His research revealed a network of associates in various cities, all running similar operations. Phone records showed regular contact with men in Phoenix, Denver, and Miami who seemed to be running identical schemes. On Thursday evening, Vince followed Miranda to what she'd claimed was a book club meeting. Instead, she drove to a high-end apartment complex where Bradley was waiting in the parking garage. Vince watched from a distance as they embraced with the familiarity of longtime lovers, not new acquaintances. Inside Bradley's apartment, which Vince observed through military-grade surveillance equipment he'd retrieved from storage, the scene was everything he'd expected. Bradley had created a carefully staged environment designed to impress. Expensive art, luxury furniture, a wine collection that probably cost more than most people's cars. All of it, Vince now knew, financed through previous relationships and current debt. He watched Miranda laugh at Bradley's jokes, saw her look at this man the way she used to look at him 15 years ago. But more than the infidelity, what enraged Vince was the manipulation. Bradley was playing Miranda like a chess piece, and she was too intoxicated by the attention to see it. That night, Vince made his first move. Using techniques from his psychological operations training, he began what the military called environmental manipulation. He hacked Bradley's credit monitoring service and triggered fraud alerts on his accounts. He anonymously reported zoning violations at Bradley's properties to the city planning office. He arranged for building inspections to be scheduled at inconvenient times. Nothing traceable. Nothing illegal enough to raise suspicions. Just enough pressure to make Bradley's life slightly more complicated each day. By Friday, Bradley was fielding calls from banks, city officials, and creditors. Vince watched the man's confident facade begin to crack as his carefully constructed world started experiencing unexplained problems. But this was just the beginning. Vince had learned that Bradley was planning something bigger with Miranda, something that would require her to access her inheritance. Phone conversations, captured through monitoring devices Vince had placed in their usual meeting locations, revealed that Bradley intended to convince Miranda to invest in a property development project. The final piece fell into place when Vince discovered the timeline. Bradley planned to propose the investment on Saturday, Miranda's actual birthday. He'd arranged a romantic evening designed to culminate in her agreeing to trust him with her financial future. Vince spent Friday night in his study, surrounded by intelligence files that painted a clear picture of the conspiracy against his marriage and his life. In Afghanistan, he dismantled insurgent networks through patience, planning, and precise execution. This situation required the same approach. He opened a secure communication channel to contacts he hadn't spoken to in years, people who owed him favors from his military service. It was time to call on those debts. By Saturday morning, Vince had assembled everything he needed for his counterstrike. Bradley Thornton thought he was hunting a naive housewife, but he'd actually wandered into the crosshairs of someone far more dangerous than he could imagine. The 15 hours Miranda had mentioned in her timeline, that would be from Saturday night to Sunday afternoon. That's when Bradley's world would begin to collapse, and Miranda would learn exactly what happened to people who betrayed Vincent Rodriguez. Chapter 3. The Setup. Saturday arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that should have made for a perfect birthday celebration. Instead, Vince spent the morning preparing for war. Miranda was in an unusually good mood, humming while she got ready for what she claimed was a quiet birthday dinner with just a few close friends. She bought a new dress, black, expensive, and definitely not the kind of thing she'd wear to a casual dinner with female friends. "You sure you'll be okay tonight?" she asked, applying lipstick in their bedroom mirror. "I know it's last minute, leaving you alone on my birthday." "I'll survive," Vince replied, watching her through the reflection. "Maybe I'll catch up on some work." Miranda kissed him goodbye at 7 p.m., and Vince immediately activated the final phase of his preparation. He'd spent the week positioning assets like pieces on a chessboard. Now it was time to start moving them. First, he confirmed Miranda's location at Bradley's apartment. Then he made a series of phone calls that would have terrified Bradley if he'd understood their significance. The first call went to Marcus Webb, a former Army Ranger who now ran a private security firm in Phoenix. Marcus owed Vince's life from an operation in Kandahar and had been waiting 8 years to return the favor. "I need surveillance on a network," Vince told him. "Multi-city operation. Financial fraud targeting married women." Marcus didn't ask questions. Within an hour, he deployed teams to monitor Bradley's associates in 3 states. The second call went to Lisa Chun, a cybersecurity specialist who'd served under Vince in military intelligence. Lisa now worked for a federal agency that preferred to remain unnamed, but she maintained private consulting work for special clients. "I need a financial forensics package," Vince explained. "Full background on multiple subjects, pattern analysis, and evidence compilation." Lisa's work was always thorough, always legal, and always admissible in court if necessary. The third call was to Tommy Kowalski, a former Marine who transitioned into Hollywood stunt work after leaving the service. Tommy specialized in creating realistic scenarios for training purposes, scenarios that could easily be adapted for other uses. By 10 p.m., Vince's network was fully operational. Marcus confirmed that Bradley's associates in other cities were indeed running identical operations, targeting at least 12 women across 4 states. Lisa had compiled enough financial evidence to prosecute Bradley and his network under federal fraud statutes. And Tommy was en route to implement what Vince privately called the education protocol. Meanwhile, through his surveillance of Bradley's apartment, Vince watched the evening unfold exactly as predicted. Bradley had spared no expense. Champagne, roses, a meal from the city's most exclusive restaurant. He was pulling out every weapon in his manipulation arsenal. At 11:30 p.m., Bradley made his pitch. Vince listened through his audio surveillance as the man painted a picture of a revolutionary real estate development that would triple Miranda's investment within 6 months. The property was supposedly in an up-and-coming neighborhood, pre-approved for luxury condominiums, with buyers already lined up. All eyes, of course. Vince had investigated the property in question. It was contaminated land with soil issues that would cost millions to remediate. Bradley knew this, but was counting on Miranda's trust and his own charm to close the deal. Miranda was hesitant at first. She mentioned needing to discuss it with her husband, which made Bradley's mask slip for just a moment. Vince saw the flash of anger cross the man's face before he recovered his composure. "Vincent's a good man," Bradley said smoothly, "but he's not an entrepreneur. This kind of opportunity requires someone who understands risk and reward. You've been carrying the financial responsibility in your marriage for years, haven't you?" The psychological manipulation was textbook. Bradley was isolating Miranda from her support system while positioning himself as her financial savior. It was exactly the kind of operation Vince had disrupted dozens of times overseas, just with different stakes. At midnight, Miranda agreed to the investment. She would transfer the money on Monday, giving Bradley access to her grandmother's inheritance. In exchange, she would become Bradley's development partner and, eventually, his wife after she divorced Vince. That's when Vince's phone rang with a call from Marcus. "Package is ready for delivery." At 12:30 a.m., while Miranda and Bradley celebrated their agreement with champagne and increasingly intimate conversation, Vince made one final call. This one went to Detective Ray Morrison, an old friend from his civilian days who worked financial crimes for the state police. "Ray, I need you to know that tomorrow you're going to receive a very interesting package about a multi-state fraud operation. The evidence is solid, the case is federal, and you're going to be the hero who cracked it." Ray had learned not to ask too many questions about Vince's sources, but he always followed up on the intelligence. Their clearance rate for financial crimes had improved dramatically since their friendship began. By 1 a.m., all the pieces were in position. Bradley thought he'd conquered another victim, but he'd actually walked into a trap that had been months in the making. In 15 hours, his world would begin to collapse in ways he couldn't imagine. Miranda thought she'd found her escape from a boring marriage and a chance at financial independence. Instead, she'd positioned herself at the center of a federal criminal investigation that would destroy everything she thought she was building. And Vince thought about the 23 people he'd cooked for, the 3 days of preparation for a celebration that never happened, and the 15 years of marriage that had ended with a text message about real family. In his military career, Vince had learned that some enemies could be negotiated with, some could be contained, and some had to be completely eliminated. Bradley and Miranda had placed themselves in the third category. As he prepared for bed, Vince reflected on a lesson from his psychological operations training. The most effective attacks weren't the ones your enemies saw coming. They were the ones that used their own momentum against them, turning their victories into their downfall. Tomorrow, the door would start shaking, but not the way Miranda expected. Chapter 4. The First Domino. Sunday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth, the kind of weather that made people want to stay in bed and postpone their responsibilities. Miranda certainly seemed inclined toward that approach. She didn't return home until nearly noon, claiming she'd stayed over at Jenny's again to recover from her birthday celebration. She was glowing with the kind of satisfaction that came from believing you'd successfully deceived someone. Her phone buzzed constantly with texts she answered while smiling, and she hummed while making coffee, completely oblivious to the fact that her world was about to implode. Vince was in his study, monitoring multiple communication channels, when the first domino fell at exactly 1:47 p.m. Detective Morrison called. "Vince, you beautiful bastard, what did you hand me?" How about the FBI calling? The DEA wants to know about money laundering connections, and Internal Revenue is sending a task force. This Bradley Thornton guy isn't just running romance scams. He's part of something massive. Through his surveillance equipment, Vince watched Bradley's phone begin ringing incessantly. The financial pressure Vince had been applying all week had triggered automated systems that flagged unusual activity patterns. When combined with Lisa Chin's forensic evidence package, the result was a perfect storm of law enforcement attention. But Vince wasn't content to let government bureaucracy handle his revenge. While federal agencies mobilized their resources, he activated Tommy Kowalski's more immediate solution. At 2:15 p.m., while Miranda was upstairs taking what she claimed was a relaxation bath, 3 men in professional suits arrived at Bradley's apartment building. To anyone watching, they looked like federal agents. They had badges, unmarked vehicles, and the kind of serious demeanor that suggested important government business. They weren't actually federal agents, of course. They were Tommy's people, former military personnel who specialized in high-stakes role-playing exercises. But their performance was flawless, especially when combined with the very real federal investigation that was simultaneously beginning. Bradley answered his door to find Agent Thompson, showing him a very official-looking warrant for his financial records. The warrant was a prop, but Bradley had no way of knowing that, especially since real federal agents would indeed be arriving within hours with genuine paperwork. Agent Thompson explained that Bradley was under investigation for operating a criminal enterprise across state lines. They had evidence of fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy charges that could result in 20 years in federal prison. They needed him to come in for questioning immediately. Bradley's confident facade cracked completely. Through Vince's audio surveillance, he could hear the man's voice rising to near panic as he tried to explain that there must be some mistake. But Agent Thompson was relentless, piling detail upon detail of Bradley's criminal activities, details that were absolutely accurate, thanks to Lisa Chin's investigation. At 2:45 p.m., Bradley made the call Vince had been waiting for. In desperation, he contacted Miranda. "Baby, we have a problem. The feds are here. They know about the business. They know about the money. They're asking about you." Miranda's phone call reached her while she was still in the bathtub upstairs. Vince heard her voice echo off the bathroom tiles as panic replaced her earlier contentment. "What do you mean they're asking about me? I haven't done anything." "They have records of our financial discussions. They know about the investment. They're saying anyone who participated in funding the operation could be charged as an accessory." This was the moment Vince had been building toward. Bradley, in his desperation, was about to throw Miranda under the federal bus to save himself. And Miranda was about to learn exactly what kind of man she'd betrayed her marriage for. "Listen," Bradley continued, his voice taking on the cold, calculating tone that Miranda had never heard before. "You need to deny everything. Tell them you never agreed to invest, that I was just some guy you met casually. If they connect you to the money, we're both fucked." Vince watched Miranda's reflection in the bathroom mirror as she processed what she was hearing. The man she'd fallen in love with, the man she'd planned to leave her husband for, was already planning to sacrifice her to protect himself. "But Bradley, I thought." "You thought what? That this was some romantic fairy tale?" "Jesus, Miranda, use your brain. This was always about the money. If you go down for this, that's your problem." The line went dead. Vince gave Miranda exactly 60 seconds to absorb the full implications of what she'd just heard. Then he made his own call, using a voice modulation device that made him sound like a different person entirely. "Mrs. Rodriguez? This is Agent Williams with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We need to speak with you immediately regarding your relationship with Bradley Thornton and your potential involvement in a federal fraud investigation." Miranda's scream echoed through the house. Vince had heard similar sounds from enemy combatants when they realized their situation was hopeless. It was the sound of someone's world collapsing in real time. 15 minutes later, Miranda stumbled downstairs in a bathrobe, her face pale and her hands shaking. She found Vince in the kitchen, calmly reading a book while drinking coffee. "Vincent," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something." Of course, he replied, setting down his book with the same calm demeanor he'd maintained throughout their marriage. What's on your mind? And then she told him everything. The affair, the lies, the planned investment, the federal investigation. She broke down completely, begging for his forgiveness, explaining that she'd been manipulated, that she'd never meant for any of this to happen. Vince listened with the patience of a man who already knew every detail of her confession. When she finished, he set down his coffee cup and looked at her with the kind of cold assessment he'd once reserved for enemy combatants. "Miranda," he said quietly, "you made your choice when you decided I wasn't real family. Now you get to live with the consequences." The doorbell rang. Through the window, Miranda could see two more men in suits standing on their front porch. These ones, Vince knew, were actually federal agents. Chapter 5, The Squeeze. The actual federal agents were nothing like Tommy's theatrical performers. Special Agent Sarah Mitchell and Agent David Park were polite, professional, and absolutely relentless in their systematic dismantling of Miranda's story. They sat in Vince's living room, the same room where Miranda had planned birthday parties and holiday celebrations, and methodically laid out evidence that painted her as a willing participant in a multi-state criminal conspiracy. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Agent Mitchell said, spreading financial documents across the coffee table, "our investigation shows regular communication between you and Mr. Thornton dating back 3 months. You attended multiple meetings where investment strategies were discussed. You made substantial cash withdrawals from your personal account." Miranda kept looking at Vince, clearly expecting him to defend her or at least show some emotion. Instead, he sat quietly in his chair, answering the agent's questions about his wife's activities with the detached precision of someone providing a witness statement. "My wife maintains her own financial accounts," he told them. "She's always been very independent about her grandmother's inheritance. I respected her privacy in those matters," which was absolutely true and made him look like a trusting husband rather than a suspicious one. The agents had built their case carefully. They had phone records, surveillance photos, financial transfers, and recorded conversations that painted a clear picture of conspiracy to commit fraud. What they didn't have yet was definitive proof that Miranda knew Bradley's development project was fraudulent. That's where Agent Park proved most dangerous. He was the psychological profiler of the team, trained to identify deception and manipulation. He studied Miranda's responses, noted her body language, and began probing for the truth. "Mrs. Rodriguez, you claim you believed Mr. Thornton's investment opportunity was legitimate. But our forensic accounting shows you withdrew the money 3 weeks ago, before Mr. Thornton provided you with any concrete documentation about the project. That suggests a level of trust that goes beyond a casual business relationship." Miranda fumbled for an explanation. He seemed very knowledgeable, very successful. "How did you verify his success? Did you visit his other properties? Speak with references? Review financial statements?" Each question tightened the noose. Miranda had done none of the due diligence a rational investor would perform because she wasn't investing based on business logic. She was funding her escape from her marriage. Vince watched the interrogation with professional admiration. These agents were good at their job, but they were working with incomplete information. They knew about the fraud conspiracy, but they didn't understand the deeper betrayal that had motivated it. After 2 hours, the agents concluded their initial interview with a warning that chilled Miranda to her core. "Mrs. Rodriguez, we're treating you as a potential victim at this stage of the investigation. However, if evidence emerges that you were a willing participant in Mr. Thornton's criminal enterprise, your status could change very quickly. We strongly recommend you consult with an attorney." After they left, Miranda collapsed onto the couch, her careful composure finally cracking completely. "Vincent, you have to help me. You know I'm not a criminal. You know I would never intentionally break the law." Vince studied his wife with the same analytical detachment he'd once applied to enemy interrogations. "What I know, Miranda, is that you've been lying to me for months. You've been planning to steal money from our marriage to fund a life with another man. And when that man was threatened, he immediately threw you to the wolves to save himself." "But I love you," she whispered. I made a mistake, but I love you. No, Vince replied, his voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. You love the security I provide. You love the lifestyle our marriage enables. But you don't love me. If you loved me, you wouldn't have excluded me from real family. That evening, while Miranda huddled in their bedroom, making desperate phone calls to attorneys, Vince received updates from his network. The federal investigation was expanding rapidly. Bradley's associates in other cities were being arrested. Financial institutions were freezing accounts. The romance fraud network that had operated for years was collapsing within hours. But the most interesting development came from Marcus Webb's surveillance team. They discovered that Bradley had fled his apartment shortly after the fake federal agents left. He'd withdrawn his remaining cash, packed hastily, and was now driving south toward Mexico. Unfortunately for Bradley, Marcus's team included former Special Forces operators who specialized in tracking high-value targets across difficult terrain. Running away from this particular problem would prove impossible. Tommy Kowalski called with an update on Bradley's psychological state. Your boy is completely broken. The fake federal visit, combined with the real investigation, has him convinced he's facing life in prison. He's been calling his associates, trying to coordinate a defense, but half of them have already been arrested. And Miranda? Vince asked. She's been calling him nonstop. He's not answering. From what I can intercept of his communications, he's telling his lawyer that she was just a mark who got in too deep. He's planning to testify against her to reduce his own sentence. This was the crucial moment in Vince's plan. Bradley and Miranda had to be isolated from each other, each believing the other was their greatest threat. Their affair had been built on mutual deception and manipulation. Now those same qualities would destroy them both. Vince made one final call of the evening, this one to Detective Morrison. Ray, you should know that your federal colleagues might be interested in some additional evidence I've uncovered. It seems Mrs. Rodriguez has been documenting her relationship with Mr. Thornton quite extensively. Photos, text messages, financial planning discussions. The kind of evidence that shows clear intent to defraud. Jesus, Vince, your own wife. My wife made her choice when she decided to exclude me from real family. Now she gets to experience the consequences of that decision. The evidence Vince referenced was real. He'd been documenting Miranda's activities for months, creating a comprehensive record of her deception. But he'd also been careful to ensure that evidence told a specific story, one that painted Miranda as a willing conspirator rather than a victim. As he prepared for bed that night, Vince reflected on the progress of his operation. In less than 24 hours, he dismantled a criminal network, destroyed his wife's affair, and positioned both Bradley and Miranda for federal prosecution. But this was only the beginning. The real revenge, the part that would teach them both the true cost of betraying Vincent Rodriguez, was still to come. Tomorrow, the door would really start shaking. Chapter 6. The Point of No Return. Monday morning brought the kind of gray, drizzling weather that perfectly matched Miranda's emotional state. She'd spent the night alternating between hysterical crying and frantic phone calls to attorneys, none of whom were particularly optimistic about her situation. Vince found her in the kitchen at 6 a.m., surrounded by legal documents and empty tissues, looking like someone who'd been awake for days. The lawyer says I could be looking at 10 years, she said without looking up. 10 years, Vincent, for trusting the wrong person. You didn't just trust the wrong person, Vince replied, pouring himself coffee with steady hands. You planned to steal $400,000 from our marriage to fund a new life with that person. There's a significant difference. Miranda flinched as if he'd slapped her. I was going to tell you everything after. After what? After you'd successfully defrauded me? After you'd established yourself financially with your lover? When exactly were you planning to be honest? Before Miranda could answer, her phone rang. The caller ID showed Bradley's number, and she answered with desperate relief. Bradley, thank God. I've been trying to reach you all night. We need to figure out how to handle this together. Shut up and listen. Bradley's voice cut through her hope like a blade. My lawyer says the only way I avoid federal prison is if I cooperate fully with the investigation. That means providing evidence about everyone involved in the operation. But I'm not involved in any operation. You're just what? An innocent victim? Miranda, you agreed to invest $400,000 in a project without doing any due diligence. You met with me dozens of times to discuss financial strategies. You withdrew money and prepared to transfer it against your husband's interests. Any prosecutor will paint you as a co-conspirator. Vince listened to the conversation through Miranda's phone speaker, admiring Bradley's complete abandonment of any pretense of affection. The man was revealing his true nature under pressure, selfish, calculating, and absolutely ruthless when his own interests were threatened. Unless, Bradley continued, you want to make this easier for both of us. What do you mean? My lawyer thinks we can paint this as a crime of passion. You were an unhappy housewife, manipulated by an older, more sophisticated criminal. You were a victim of my psychological manipulation, not a willing participant. But that only works if you're willing to testify against me. The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds. Vince could see Miranda processing the implications. Testify against Bradley and potentially avoid prison, or maintain their relationship and face federal prosecution together. You're asking me to destroy you to save myself, she finally said. I'm asking you to be smart. This isn't some romantic movie, Miranda. This is federal prison. Choose carefully. The line went dead. Miranda stared at her phone, then at Vince, then at the legal documents scattered across the table. For the first time since this began, she seemed to fully grasp that her fairy tale romance had transformed into a nightmare with no easy escape. Vincent, she said quietly, I need your help. To do what? To figure out how to survive this. You're the smartest person I know. You understand strategy. You understand how systems work. I know I don't deserve your help, but you're asking anyway. Vince set down his coffee and studied his wife with cold assessment. Miranda, you've spent the last 6 months planning to betray me in the most comprehensive way possible. You've stolen money, lied repeatedly, planned to abandon our marriage, and excluded me from real family. Now you want my help because your backup plan collapsed? I made mistakes. You made choices. Deliberate, calculated choices. The only mistake you made was underestimating how thoroughly those choices would destroy your life. At 9 a.m., Agent Mitchell called to inform Miranda that she needed to come in for additional questioning. The FBI had recovered communications between Bradley and his associates that mentioned her by name, and they needed clarification about her role in the conspiracy. Miranda looked at Vince with something approaching panic. Will you come with me? As my husband? Even if it's just for support. Vince considered the request. In his military career, he'd learned that sometimes the most devastating attacks came from unexpected directions. Miranda was expecting him to either abandon her completely or provide unconditional support. Neither response would teach her the lesson she needed to learn. I'll drive you to the federal building, he said finally. But Miranda, understand something clearly. You're going to face the consequences of your choices. I'm not going to save you from them. The drive to the federal building was conducted in silence, Miranda staring out the window while Vince navigated traffic with the same calm precision he brought to everything else. At a red light, she finally spoke. Do you hate me? Hate is an emotion, Vince replied. What I feel for you is much colder than hate. What does that mean? It means you've taught me that the person I thought I married never actually existed. The woman I loved, the woman I built a life with, the woman I trusted completely. She was a fiction. You show me exactly who you really are when you think you can get away with betrayal. People make mistakes, Vincent. People can change. Some mistakes are forgivable. Some aren't. When you decided I wasn't real family, you crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. They pulled up to the federal building, where Agent Mitchell was waiting. As Miranda got out of the car, she turned back to Vince with an expression of desperate hope. Will you be here when I get out? Vince looked at his wife, at the woman who'd shared his bed for 15 years, who'd planned birthday parties and holiday celebrations, who'd sworn to honor and cherish him until death do them part, and felt absolutely nothing. That depends, he said, on whether you finally decide to tell the truth about everything you've done. As Miranda walked into the federal building, escorted by agents who would spend the next several hours documenting her crimes, Vince made a phone call that would determine the final phase of his revenge. Tommy, it's time for the last act. Our friend Bradley thinks he's running to Mexico to escape justice. I want you to ensure he receives a proper education about the consequences of his choices before the federal marshals find him. Copy that. Any specific parameters? Nothing permanent. But I want him to understand exactly what happens to people who destroy other people's families. Make it memorable. Roger. Anything else? Yes. When Miranda gets home tonight, she's going to find divorce papers and an eviction notice. Make sure everything is legally bulletproof. I want her to understand that betrayal has consequences that extend far beyond federal prosecution. And if she doesn't cooperate with the proceedings? Vince thought about the 23 people he'd cooked for, the 3 days of preparation for a celebration that never happened, and the text message that had ended his marriage. Then she'll discover that federal prison might actually be safer than dealing with me directly. Chapter 7. The Trap Springs. By the time Miranda returned from her FBI interview at 6 p.m., her world had fundamentally shifted. The federal agents had presented her with evidence that painted her not as Bradley's victim, but as a willing co-conspirator who had helped plan and finance a criminal enterprise. They had recordings of her discussing investment strategies. They had evidence of her accessing her inheritance specifically to fund Bradley's operation. Most damaging of all, they had recovered text messages where she'd encouraged Bradley to be creative about documentation requirements and not worry about bureaucratic red tape. Messages she'd sent thinking she was being supportive of her lover's business acumen. Messages that now read like criminal conspiracy to defraud. She opened the front door of her house, expecting to find Vince waiting with sympathy, or at least familiar surroundings that might provide some comfort. Instead, she found a man in an expensive suit sitting at her kitchen table, reviewing documents with the methodical precision of someone conducting business. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he said, standing as she entered. "I'm attorney Robert Hayes. Your husband has retained my services for certain legal matters that require immediate attention." Miranda looked around frantically for Vince, but the house felt different, colder, more formal, like a business office rather than a home. "Where's Vincent?" "Mr. Rodriguez is conducting other business this evening. He asked me to review these documents with you and ensure you understand your legal situation." Hayes spread papers across the table with the same clinical efficiency the FBI agents had used. But these weren't criminal evidence. They were divorce papers, asset division agreements, and a restraining order that would prevent Miranda from accessing their joint accounts or remaining in their shared home. "I don't understand," Miranda said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Vincent said he would help me." "Mr. Rodriguez is helping you," Hayes replied. "He's ensuring that his own legal exposure is minimized before your federal case proceeds to trial. These documents protect both of you from additional criminal liability related to your financial activities." The divorce papers were thorough and unforgiving. Vince was claiming adultery and criminal misconduct as grounds for dissolution. He was seeking to protect all marital assets from seizure related to Miranda's federal charges. He was requesting that Miranda bear full responsibility for any legal costs related to her criminal defense. Most crushingly, he was seeking to prevent her from claiming any spousal privilege or community property rights that might complicate her prosecution. "This is all standard procedure," Hayes explained with professional detachment. "When one spouse faces federal charges related to fraud, the other spouse must protect themselves legally and financially. But I haven't been charged with anything yet. Mrs. Rodriguez, based on the evidence I've reviewed, criminal charges are inevitable. The only question is whether you'll cooperate with federal prosecutors to minimize your sentence or attempt to fight charges that will almost certainly result in conviction." That's when Miranda's phone rang with a call for Bradley. This time, his voice was different, strained, frightened, and speaking quickly as if he was afraid of being overheard. "Miranda, listen carefully. I'm in serious trouble. Some people came to see me tonight, and they weren't federal agents. They knew things about me, about my past, about operations I ran years ago. They said they were sent by someone who doesn't appreciate people who destroy families." Miranda felt ice forming in her stomach. "What kind of people?" "Professionals. Military types. They didn't hurt me, but they made it very clear that running away wasn't going to solve my problems. They said I had two choices: turn myself into the feds and accept responsibility for everything I've done, or face consequences that would make federal prison look like a vacation. Bradley, who were they working for? I think your husband is a lot more dangerous than either of us realized. The call ended abruptly, leaving Miranda staring at her phone while Attorney Hayes continued his methodical review of her legal destruction. Mrs. Rodriguez, I need you to understand something very clearly, Hayes said, his voice taking on a tone of professional concern. Your husband has documentation of your activities dating back 6 months. Bank records, surveillance photos, recorded conversations, detailed timelines of your relationship with Mr. Thornton. This evidence will be made available to federal prosecutors if it becomes necessary to protect Mr. Rodriguez's interests. He was spying on me? He was protecting himself from criminal liability related to your activities. Mr. Rodriguez suspected you were engaged in financial misconduct and took appropriate steps to document your actions for potential legal proceedings. Miranda felt the walls closing in from every direction. The federal government thought she was a criminal. Bradley was planning to testify against her to reduce his own sentence. And her husband, the man she'd assumed would be devastated by her betrayal, had apparently been building a case against her for months. What does Vincent want from me? She asked. Full cooperation with federal prosecutors. Complete honesty about your activities with Mr. Thornton. Acceptance of responsibility for your criminal conduct. An agreement to these divorce terms without contest or delay. And if I don't agree? Hayes paused in his document review and looked at Miranda with the kind of clinical assessment usually reserved for laboratory specimens. Mrs. Rodriguez, your husband spent 20 years in military intelligence. He specialized in psychological operations and hostile interrogation resistance. He has contacts throughout law enforcement, federal agencies, and private security organizations. He has documented every aspect of your criminal conspiracy in detail. Hayes let that information settle before continuing. If you attempt to fight the divorce, implicate him in your criminal activities, or make this process more difficult than necessary, he will ensure that federal prosecutors have access to evidence that will guarantee your conviction on the most serious charges possible. You will face maximum sentences, maximum penalties, and maximum consequences. But I'm his wife. You were his wife when you decided he wasn't real family. You were his wife when you planned to steal $400,000 from your marriage. You were his wife when you spent 3 days cooking for 23 people, then excluded him from your birthday celebration. Hayes gathered his documents with practiced efficiency. Mr. Rodriguez asked me to remind you of something. In his military career, he learned that some enemies can be negotiated with, some can be contained, and some must be completely eliminated. You chose which category you belong in when you sent that text message. As Attorney Hayes left, Miranda found herself alone in a house that no longer felt like home, holding divorce papers that would strip away everything she'd taken for granted, facing federal charges that could destroy her life. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The door is shaking because everything you built on lies is finally collapsing. You wanted to know about real family? Now you'll learn that real family doesn't betray each other for money and sexual gratification. Miranda called Vince's number, but it went straight to voicemail. She called his office, but they said he was unavailable. She drove to places she thought he might be, but found nothing. Vincent Rodriguez had vanished from her life as completely as if he'd never existed, leaving behind only the systematic destruction of everything she'd thought was secure. The door wasn't just shaking, it was being torn off its hinges. Chapter 8. Complete Collapse. Tuesday morning brought Miranda's world crashing down with the efficiency of a controlled demolition. She woke up in what had been her marital bed, surrounded by legal documents that detailed the complete dismantling of her life, only to discover that her phone had been buzzing all night with calls from numbers she didn't recognize. The first voicemail was from Agent Mitchell. Mrs. Rodriguez, we need to speak immediately. New evidence has emerged that significantly changes your legal situation. The second was from her attorney. Miranda, call me urgently. The federal prosecutors are moving faster than expected. The third was from her bank. Mrs. Rodriguez, your accounts have been frozen pending federal investigation. And the fourth was from a number she didn't recognize, with a message that chilled her to the bone. This is Bradley. They got me. I'm in federal custody. My lawyer says the only way I can reduce my sentence is to provide complete testimony about all co-conspirators. I'm sorry, but I have to tell them everything. Miranda stumbled to her kitchen to find that even her coffee maker had been removed. In fact, as she looked around more carefully, she realized that most of the house's contents were gone. Furniture, electronics, artwork, even kitchen appliances. Everything that could be claimed as Vince's separate property or jointly owned assets that might be subject to federal seizure had been systematically removed. A note on the counter explained the situation in Vince's precise handwriting. All marital assets are being secured to prevent federal seizure related to your criminal activities. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises. Your personal clothing and effects are packed in the garage. Miranda called Vince's number repeatedly, but each call went straight to a voicemail message that was coldly professional. This is Vincent Rodriguez. I'm not taking calls related to ongoing federal investigations or divorce proceedings. All communication should be directed through my attorney. By 10 a.m., Miranda was sitting in her lawyer's office, learning that her situation had deteriorated overnight beyond what anyone had predicted. The prosecutors are offering a plea deal, her attorney explained, but it's harsh. Conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, and criminal enterprise charges. They want 12 years, full restitution, and your complete cooperation in testifying against other members of the network. 12 years. Miranda, they have evidence that goes back months. They have recordings of you discussing financial strategies with Bradley. They have documentation of your knowledge about the fraudulent nature of his investments. They have evidence that you were planning to use your inheritance to expand the criminal operation. But I didn't know it was criminal. That's not what the evidence shows. Your husband provided them with surveillance recordings that capture you discussing ways to avoid bureaucratic oversight and streamline regulatory requirements for Bradley's development projects. Any jury will interpret that as evidence of criminal intent. Miranda felt the room spinning around her. Vincent recorded me extensively. The federal prosecutors describe it as some of the most comprehensive documentation of a criminal conspiracy they've ever seen. Your husband apparently documented every meeting, every phone call, every financial transaction for months. That afternoon, Miranda learned the full extent of Vince's preparation when Agent Mitchell arrived at her lawyer's office with a complete summary of the federal case. Mrs. Rodriguez, we now have testimony from 3 of Mr. Thornton's former associates. They describe a coordinated network that specialized in targeting married women with significant assets. Your case fits the pattern perfectly. Isolation from spouse, financial manipulation, romantic attachment used to facilitate fraud. Agent Mitchell spread photos across the table. Surveillance images that showed Miranda and Bradley together at restaurants, hotels, and planning meetings. But these weren't blurry, distant shots. They were clear, detailed photographs that captured conversations, documents, and intimate moments with professional precision. Your husband provided us with these images as evidence of your criminal association with Mr. Thornton. He also provided audio recordings of your discussions about using your inheritance to fund Mr. Thornton's operations. Miranda stared at the photos, realizing that Vince had been watching her for months. Every romantic dinner, every private conversation, every moment she'd thought was secret had been documented with military precision. However, Agent Mitchell continued, your husband has also provided evidence that might support a different narrative. He recorded conversations where Mr. Thornton specifically coached you on how to avoid involving your husband in financial decisions. There's documentation of Mr. Thornton isolating you from your support system and manipulating your emotional vulnerabilities. What does that mean? It means you have a choice. Accept responsibility for willingly participating in a criminal conspiracy, or cooperate fully with our investigation by testifying that you were manipulated and defrauded by Mr. Thornton and his associates. And if I testify against Bradley? Reduced charges. possibly probation instead of prison. But you'll have to provide complete testimony about everything. The affair, the financial planning, the criminal conspiracy, everything you know about Mr. Thornton's operation. That evening, Miranda sat in her empty house, surrounded by boxes containing the remnants of her life, trying to process the full scope of her situation. Her marriage was over. Her savings were frozen. Her lover was planning to testify against her. And her husband, the man she'd betrayed and dismissed as not real family, had orchestrated the complete destruction of her world with surgical precision. Her phone buzzed with a text from Vince. You have until Friday to decide whether you want to cooperate with federal prosecutors or face trial on maximum charges. Choose carefully. This is the last decision you'll get to make independently for quite some time. Miranda called the number, but it was already disconnected. She realized then that Vincent Rodriguez hadn't just documented her betrayal. He'd orchestrated her complete destruction while giving her every opportunity to incriminate herself further. He'd played her and Bradley against each other, turned their criminal conspiracy into federal evidence, and positioned himself as the wronged husband who tried to save his marriage despite his wife's criminal activities. The door wasn't just shaking anymore. It had been blown completely off its hinges, and Miranda was standing in the wreckage of everything she'd thought was secure, facing a choice between betraying her lover or facing decades in federal prison. Either way, Vincent Rodriguez had won completely. Chapter 9. Aftermath. 6 months later, Vincent Rodriguez sat in his new downtown apartment, reading the morning newspaper's coverage of the federal fraud trial that had concluded the previous day. The headline read, Romance Fraud Network Dismantled, 23 Defendants Convicted. Miranda had ultimately chosen to cooperate with federal prosecutors, testifying against Bradley and his associates in exchange for a reduced sentence of 2 years plus restitution. Bradley himself had received 15 years after attempting to flee the country and refusing to provide substantial assistance to the investigation. Vince folded the newspaper and set it aside. The criminal proceedings were just one element of his comprehensive victory. The divorce had been finalized 3 months ago, with Miranda receiving nothing beyond her personal effects and a substantial debt for legal fees. The house had been sold, with all proceeds going to Vince as the wrong party in the dissolution. More satisfying than the financial victory was the complete destruction of Miranda's social standing. Her cooperation with federal prosecutors had required her to detail every aspect of her affair, her financial planning with Bradley, and her deliberate deception of her husband. The testimony had been public record, covered extensively by local media, and had effectively ended any possibility of Miranda rebuilding her life in their community. Vince's phone rang with a call from Detective Morrison. Vince, thought you'd want to know. Your boy Bradley had a rough time in federal lockup while he was awaiting trial. Apparently someone spread word about his romance fraud operation, and the other inmates didn't appreciate anyone who targeted vulnerable women. He requested protective custody after the third incident. Unfortunate. Vince replied with complete neutrality. Also, the feds want me to thank you again for the intelligence that broke this case open. That network was operating in 12 states and had defrauded nearly 200 women over 8 years. Your documentation was the key to dismantling the entire operation. After ending the call, Vince walked to his window overlooking the city. He'd rebuilt his life with the same methodical precision he'd applied to destroying his enemies. New apartment, new consulting contracts, new social circles that appreciated his intelligence and integrity while knowing nothing about his capacity for ruthless revenge. His doorbell rang, and Vince opened it to find Miranda standing in the hallway. She looked older, worn down by months of legal proceedings and the reality of her situation. She was scheduled to begin her prison sentence the following week. Vincent, I know you don't want to see me, but I needed to say something before. Come in, he said, stepping aside. Miranda entered his apartment tentatively, looking around at the space he'd created without her. It was stylish, comfortable, and completely devoid of any trace of their shared history. I wanted to apologize, she said. Not because I think it will change anything, but because you deserve to hear it. I destroyed our marriage, I betrayed your trust, and I treated you like you didn't matter. I was wrong about everything. Vince studied his former wife with the same clinical detachment he'd maintained throughout their destruction. She was telling the truth now, but it was far too late for honesty to matter. Miranda, do you understand what you actually did? I cheated on you. I lied to you. I planned to steal money from our marriage. Those were just the symptoms. What you actually did was prove that 15 years of marriage meant nothing to you. You demonstrated that when you thought you could get away with it, you were willing to betray everything we'd built together. Miranda's eyes filled with tears. I know I can't fix it. I know I can't earn your forgiveness. But I needed you to know that I understand what I lost. What you lost, Vince replied, was the protection and security that came from being married to someone who honored his commitments. You gambled that security on a criminal who saw you as nothing more than a convenient source of money. I was stupid. I was selfish. You were exactly who you chose to be when you thought the consequences didn't matter. Vince walked to his desk and retrieved a manila envelope. Before you begin your prison sentence, there's something you should understand about the man you threw away your marriage for. He handed her the envelope, which contained photographs and documents that painted a comprehensive picture of Bradley's criminal history. Your lover wasn't just running romance frauds. He was trafficking drugs through his real estate operations. He was laundering money for organized crime. He was involved in identity theft networks across 5 states. Miranda stared at the evidence, her face growing pale. If you had succeeded in your plan to leave me for Bradley, you wouldn't have become his partner in a legitimate business. You would have become an accessory to major criminal enterprises that would have destroyed your life far more completely than anything you're facing now. You knew all this? I discovered it during my investigation. Bradley wasn't just targeting you for your inheritance. He was planning to use you as a front for money laundering operations. Your legitimate background and clean financial history would have made you the perfect, unwitting accomplice for federal crimes that carry 20-year minimum sentences. Vince let that information settle before continuing. Miranda, you didn't just betray our marriage for another man. You betrayed our marriage for a criminal who was planning to destroy your life far more thoroughly than I ever could. Miranda sat down heavily, finally understanding the full scope of what she'd almost walked into. So you saved me? No, I saved myself. You made your choice when you decided I wasn't real family. Everything that happened after that was simply the logical consequence of that decision. Miranda stood to leave, then turned back one final time. Do you hate me now? Vince considered the question with the same analytical precision he brought to everything else. Hate requires emotional investment. You're simply a problem I solved, Miranda. Nothing more than that. After she left, Vince returned to his window, overlooking the city. In the distance, he could see the federal courthouse where Miranda would report next week to begin serving her sentence. He felt no satisfaction in her punishment, no regret about her fate, no lingering attachment to the woman who'd shared his life for 15 years. Vincent Rodriguez had learned that some betrayals were so complete they burn away every trace of love, leaving behind only the cold satisfaction of perfect justice. His phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus Webb. New client wants to hire the team for a similar operation. Husband suspected wife of fraud conspiracy. Interested, Vince deleted the message without responding. He'd served his country for 20 years and defended his marriage for 15. Now, for the first time in his adult life, Vincent Rodriguez answered to no one but himself. The door had finished shaking. Everything built on lies had collapsed. And in the rubble of that destruction, Vince had built something new, a life where betrayal was impossible because trust was no longer required. He opened his laptop and began researching property investments in Costa Rica. It was time to disappear completely, leaving behind a city full of people who would remember Vincent Rodriguez as the man who destroyed a criminal network and survived his wife's betrayal with his integrity intact. None of them would ever know how dangerous it was to betray someone who knew exactly how to make enemies disappear forever. The story was complete. The revenge was perfect. The consequences were permanent. And Vincent Rodriguez was finally absolutely free. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen, and I'll see you there.